Hi there, and welcome back to another episode of Geography Girl. I have another absolutely rip-roaring episode for you today. We're going to be talking about the London body snatchers. It's classic Victorian era true crime, which is just bellissimo combination of two of my favourite subjects. Crime, London era, Victorian era shenanigans. So let's get into it. So this is stemming from a wee obsession that I've currently got with thanatourism, or like dark history or dark true crime tourism in London, and I've been doing a little bit of a series going to different historical sites where shit went down. So hopefully you'll see a lot more coming from me on these kind of topics, and if you've got anything that you want to suggest, like paranormal pubs or places where people were hung or crime in general, then put them in the comments and let me know what you want to see, because I love this as much as you do. So on to the episode. So imagine spooky London in the 1820s. You're walking through a cemetery, it's late at night, it's pitch black actually, and it's foggy, and through the flickering lamps you see someone digging up a grave. And as you come closer, you realise they're not digging for treasure or revenge, they're actually digging up the body. That's better, I'm a bit squarer now. So we've now entered the weird world of Victorian London's body snatchers, or as they like to be called, the resurrection men. Because in Victorian and Georgian London, there was not any rest for the wicked. Just because you were dead didn't mean that you were safe. In fact, if you were a fresh burial, you were prime picking for these body snatchers. Your body was valuable, and there would be people who would do absolutely anything to get their hands on it. If you ever find yourself strolling through the streets of Old Street in London, there is a patch of grass behind it, which I've actually walked through this and I didn't actually realise, and you can very easily just stroll through it without giving it a second thought. It's actually called Bunhill Fields, and it's tucked away, and it is literally full of history. Bunhill has a very spooky name. It actually means bone hill, and that is because in 1549 over 1,000 cartloads of bones were brought here from Charnel House of St Paul's Cathedral. That cemetery had overflowed and it needed somewhere for the bodies to go, so it dumped them at Bone Hill. And so tall was this mound that windmills were built on top of it. Okay, so by the time Bone Hill Cemetery was closed, in 1854, it contained over 123,000 bodies. And that's not all, it was also a hotspot for a much more sinister trade of body snatching. To understand all of this, we need to take it back now, yo. Dissecting humans was once considered scandalous and even blasphemous in the time where religion reigned supreme. For centuries in Western Europe, human dissector was rare, illegal, and done in secret. Much of the early understanding of anatomy aimed from animal dissection, which, as you can imagine, led to some creative misinterpretations of how the body actually worked. But obviously, to every rule there are exceptions, and our favourite Leonardo da Vinci, who you might know from the painting the Mona Lisa and sketching flying machines, was obsessed with anatomy. He dissected more than 30 human bodies and produced hundreds of drawings. Many of them were years above his time. He correctly identified the number and the roots of human teeth and was able to identify liver cirrhosis as well. He also made a lot of discoveries about the heart, which weren't able to be confirmed for centuries. But where did Da Vinci get his bodies from? Almost certainly body snatchers. Another pioneer, Andreas Vesalius, often dug up bodies himself from around the cemeteries of Paris. Science and grave robbing has always had a very complex relationship. So let's fast forward to 19th century London. It's an age of industrialisation, dirty streets, rapid urbanisation, and an exploding interest in science and medicine. Medical schools were booming and everyone wanted to study anatomy. And in order to study anatomy, you needed bodies. But there was a problem. There were not enough cadavers to go around. At the time, the Murder Act of 1751 allowed the bodies of executed murderers to be used for scientific dissection. But murder was becoming less common, and in England and Wales there were only 200, I say only 200, that seems like a lot, 200 crimes that carried the death penalty, and in Scotland there was fewer than 50. And with reforms like the Judgment of Death Act in 1823, even fewer people were being hung. So if you're a medical school and you're trying to teach 100 pupils, but you're only getting 3 cadavers a year, you can see how there would be a problem. And this is where the resurrection men enter the chat. The body snatchers, or the resurrectionists, however you want to call them, would enter graves at night, would work in teams. They'd identify fresh graves and they'd sneak in under the cover of darkness with lanterns, shovel, a cart, and get in and out in less than half an hour. Amazingly, the clothes would be left behind because stealing clothes would be a criminal offence, but stealing a body somehow wouldn't be. Weirdly, because bodies weren't considered to be property. This meant that some of these men could dig up to a dozen bodies per night. London's biggest body snatching gang was the Borough Gang in the 1810s. They supplied London's growing number of hospitals and anatomy schools, such as St Bartholomew's and Guy's Hospital, and many, many more. Now, it's really easy to imagine these as some cartoonish villains, but this was a real business run by real people. It's horrible and it's ghoulish, but it was a business nonetheless, and it was very lucrative. Bodies could be sold for the equivalent of hundreds of pounds, and obviously there is money in death. But like all black markets, things got darker and they got out of hand. Because if digging up the dead was profitable, then murdering the living to sell their bodies was also even more so. Which brings us to Edinburgh. In the 1820s, there were 2 Irish immigrants, William Burke and William Hare, who were living in Edinburgh. One of Hare's lodgers, an army pensioner known as Old Donald, had died of natural causes. He had left a large debt of £4 of rent, which is around 270 today, which cost of living, a girl could only dream. So to cover the cost of this debt, the 2 conspired to sell his body. They took it down to Professor Knox at the anatomy school at the Surgeon Square in Edinburgh. Knox was a prominent anatomy professor and he paid well, really well. The pair made a handsome profit, making £508 in today's money for Donald's body. And so the pair could just not help themselves. They began luring lodgers and false security, plying them with alcohol and jumping them when they were too drunk. They were smothered using a method known as burking, which would leave no marks, and packed into a tea chest and then sold to Knox. In just 1 year, they killed 16 people, but the pair did get careless. They killed one boy who was a local boy with a club foot and a limp, who was recognised by the surgeons. Knox is said once he kind of felt like he was being cottoned onto or there was something fishy going on because he didn't actually meet with Hare and Burke directly, is said to have cut off his feet and his head, so he clearly knew something was awry. So between Hare and Burke, the 2 began to fall out, with Hare cutting Burke out of his deals with Knox. It all came to a head one Halloween night when Burke requested that his lodgers go and stay with Hare for a night whilst a distant relative came and stayed with him. This distant relative was Marjorie Docherty, who were the pair's last victim. But there was a plot twist. Burke's lodgers, who had forgotten some items, burst back into the room where they were to discover the dead body of Marjorie. They reported the murder, but at that point the body had already been sold to Knox. The men were arrested and actually began to turn on each other. Hare was offered immediate immunity to testify against Burke, and that he did, with Burke being found guilty and hung in 1829. His body, ironically, was donated to medical science and can still be seen in Surgeons' Hall today in Edinburgh. What happened to Hare is unknown. By 1831, the Burke and Hare scandal had travelled south. The name had become shorthand for a new kind of horror, murder for medical profit. And sure enough, in London's East End, a group of copycats emerged, and they came to be known as the London Burkers. The gang was led by 2 men, John Bishop, who was a former farmer, and Thomas Williams, who was a bricklayer. They operated out of a dingy cottage in Nova Scotia Gardens in Bethnal Green, then a swampy, poverty-stricken part of London riddled with slums, gasworks and open sewage. Unlike traditional resurrection men who exhumed fresh corpses from cemeteries, Bishops and Williams decided to cut out the middleman. Why would you wait for someone to die when you can hasten the process yourself? Their victims were often children, vagrants and the mentally ill, people who wouldn't be missed. The gang's methods were horrifyingly methodical. They would lure victims into the cottage under false pretensions, often offering them food, drink, or a place to stay. Once they were in, they would drug them, often with opium, and then drown them in a well in the garden or in a large wash tub, a method that left no visible marks on the body. One of Bishop's later confessions described it as a technique as quiet and without blood, much like Burke and Hare's infamous method of smothering. One of their victims was a 14-year-old boy named Carlo Ferrari, who was an Italian street performer who worked with trained white mice. He was known to sleep rough near the Adelphi Theatre. Bishop said they found him shivering with cold and lured him with the promise of warmth. Hours later, his body was sold to the anatomy school in King's College. Another victim was a young woman from Lincolnshire, Fanny Pigburn. She had come to London looking for work. Bishop claimed that she was friendless and had nowhere to go. He offered her shelter and she never left. The gang sold bodies to London schools for around £10 each, which is over £1,000 in today's money. And they got greedy. Bishop later admitted to killing between 60 and 70 victims over a 12-year period. That figure has never actually been confirmed. But eventually it was suspicion that brought them down. In November of 1831, they turned up at King's College London trying to sell a body. This was a teenage boy whose body was just a little bit too fresh. There was no sign of disease, no dirt under the fingernails, no burial marks, and no reason the young lad should be dead. The suspicious anatomist actually alerted the police, and Bishop and Williams were arrested that same day. Their cottage was raided, and what the police found was chilling. There was clothing from the victims, a length of rope, buckets, and the infamous well in the back of the garden, where many of the murders had taken place. The garden soil itself was disturbed and soaked through. Forensic evidence was minimal back then, but the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. The trial was a media spectacle. Public outrage was at a boiling point. Bishop and Williams maintained at the time that they had found the bodies, and that they had come by them honestly. But under the pressure, Bishop confessed. He admitted to the murders of 3 people, the Italian boy, the Lincolnshire girl, and a male lodger named Cunningham. They were both found guilty and hung at Newgate Prison on the 5th of December, 1831. A crowd of tens of thousands of people gathered. It was said that not a single window along the route remained unoccupied. But perhaps the most poetic ending to this story, there was an ironic twist of fate as their bodies were dissected and used for medical study. Bishop's skull was put on display at the Royal College of Surgeons, and William's skeleton is still held at the Hunterian Museum in London, where it's been used for anatomical education for years. This case caused an uproar. The press called them fiends in human shape. The public demanded reform, and they got it. In 1832, the Parliament passed an Anatomy Act, which was a turning point in British medical history. The Act allowed licensed anatomy schools to legally access unclaimed bodies from workhouses, hospitals, and prisons. It created a formal licensing system for dissections and began to successfully reduce the black market for cadavers. But this did just mean that the poor and deaf were still serving the medical and the elite. Just now it was legal. Yet, even with all of this reform, the legacy of body snatchers still lingers. In graveyards across the country, including in Bunhill Fields, you'll still spot iron cages above old graves. These were called mortsafes, designed to keep the resurrection men at bay. There are also heavy slabs, metal bars, and even watchmen to keep guard of the dead. And that is the end of our story today. I still cannot believe that Bunhill, which is just streets away from Old Street in the middle of London, has 123,000 bodies buried there. It is absolutely insane. If you enjoyed this story, please give us a like and subscribe for more, and let me know of any other stories you would like to tell or any vlogs you would like to see. I would love to do some vlogging around London's historical sites, so please just let me know, and I'll catch you next time. Goodbye.